Okay, let's get started. My name is Matt Friedman. I'm the CEO of the Mekong Club. And today we are going to do a presentation that is named COVID, ESGs, and Going to the Moon, How Business Can Unite to Eliminate Forced Labor. Wow, what a title. It may not sound or seem very clear what we're talking about at the beginning, but I hope as we get into this presentation, you'll have a much better understanding. So to begin with, I'm going back to 2018. Reuters had a summit called the Stop Slavery Summit, and I was asked as part of this summit to do a talk on the private sector's involvement in addressing modern slavery. And I called it my Moon Goals speech, because I was tasked with coming up with a presentation that was inspirational, insightful, and attempting to give a general direction to what the private sector needs in order to address modern slavery. So as part of this talk, I started off by saying, when NASA was set up in 1959, the organization really didn't have much of a clue of what they needed to do other than to get rockets up in space. They were behind the Soviet Union and they felt like they needed to catch up. But there wasn't an overall strategy that the organization had. But this changed in 1961. Kennedy came along and said, why don't we send a man to the moon within this decade and get these people back safely? And so all of a sudden you had this suggestion in order to overtake the Soviet Union with something that was grandiose, something that was visionary, but something at the same time that a lot of people said couldn't happen. We didn't have big computers back then. We didn't have a lot of technology to come up with something that would achieve this. And a lot of people said it just can't be done. But he decided it was going to be done anyways. And so NASA was given a certain amount of money. And then all of a sudden, NASA had a focus, a very clear focus to get people to the moon and then to get them back safely. And so a lot of emphasis was placed on the module so that when it landed on the moon, it landed safely. You had to come up with the calculations for the trajectories, for kind of seeing that the rocket got to the right place at the right time. You had to make sure that the rocket thrust had all of the engines in place. You had to come up with a suit that would ensure that when they were walking, they would be able to do it safely. All of these things were put in place. And then 8 years later, a couple of men went to the moon. And since then, we've had multiple other missions where that happened. A feat that people said couldn't be done, achieved in a very spectacular way. And so this was considered to be a great human achievement. You know, we had celebrations all over the world. When you stop and ask, what are some of the most important, impressive things that ever happened in history, this one comes up on the top of the list all the time. So it was a great achievement. So let me stop there for a moment and switch over to the topic at hand, modern slavery. As many of you know, there's over 40 million people in modern slavery today. In fact, there are more slaves today than any other time in history. The profits generated from modern slavery, $150 billion a year, second only to drug trafficking, second largest transnational crime, tremendous amount of business associated with this. And 16 million of the victims of the 40 million are associated with the private sector. So there is a link between the business world in this particular topic. But when you stop and look at the combined efforts of the NGOs, the governments, the United Nations, it's less than 0.5% of the victims were helped. And this number has been consistently at this level for a long time. Now, when we stop and look at the private sector, I've been working with them for about 10 years, and I've seen a significant transition over time in terms of what the private sector has done. But going back 10 years ago, what we often saw were statements like this coming from the private sector. Well, we're not do-gooder organizations. We're private companies. We don't have the resources to kind of put in this particular direction. Well, what's the incentive for getting involved in this? This is kind of an NGO type of thing. We don't really understand what the topic is and why it is that we have to be focusing on this. While there was a lot of data that was available, it wasn't really being shared. Many of the organizations that were private companies that had supply chains weren't really working together. There was very little standardization. And we heard a lot of talk about how there would be a loss of profitability if the private sector were to get involved. About 8 years ago, we had changes that took place that resulted in some of these things being replaced with the private sector being actively and aggressively involved in addressing this. We had legislation, the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. We had the UK Modern Slavery Act, the Australian Act, the French Act. We had lawsuits that created risks for companies. We saw media coverage increasing. We saw a significant interest in ESG. And so since then, a lot of amazing things have happened. Companies have stepped up. They put systems and procedures in place. They've made a real difference in addressing modern slavery. But the one thing that has been lacking throughout all of this time is a united plan of action. Now, I've been in the development sector for about 30 years. In HIV/AIDS, you have a plan that goes all the way from the top to the bottom. It's about a 60-page document that explains what HIV/AIDS is at every level. We see this with tuberculosis, malaria, education, poverty alleviation. All of those sectors have a plan of action. But in the counter-trafficking world, we don't have one either for the public sector side or the private sector side. And so after I went through all of that description at this conference, we posed a question. What would a similar business moon goal be for the private sector in addressing modern slavery? And what we mean by this is something that is super ambitious, and it's up there as a major goal that if it's achieved, something amazing would happen. But it has to be something that's not impossible. We also felt it had to be something that could free millions of people from exploitative labor practices while not forcing business to choose between what is right, what is sustainable, and what is profitable. And so we answered the question by saying our proposed moon goal is that the private sector will eliminate forced labor from its supply chains by 2030 without a negative impact on profitability. Now, in the audience, everyone clapped. A lot of people came up afterwards and said, wow, that's really great. That's a great idea. But a lot of people didn't really understand what it was I was proposing, because the plan that was being suggested is something quite specific. But I went through the plan a little bit. And what we came to describe as how we would get to this particular place of achieving this great goal was by first identifying the target. And so out of 40 million people, you have a lot of people who are in forced marriages. When you eliminate that, you get down to forced labor, about 25 million people in forced labor, about 16 million of them associated with supply chains. You've heard me use that number. 11 million in construction, manufacturing, and agriculture. When it comes to supply chain modern slavery, it's about 3.7 million. So our target with that particular goal would be this group, not the 40 million. And it demonstrates that it's a lot more manageable. So the second thing that I talked about was, in order to achieve this, you'd have to do a few things. You'd need standardized capacity building. Rather than everyone else coming up with their own training, just have one repository, and that repository basically kind of is up to date, cutting edge, and gives everybody what they need. Multi-stakeholder communities, getting the private sector companies together so they can talk and debate and work with each other. And then to get the multi-stakeholder groups like the Mekong Club and Be Slavery Free and Slave Free Alliance and those to also work together. So we have this continuous community across different geographical locations. Identify a couple of tools and techniques that we can all agree to and use across the board. So at least we have that standardization and that means of collecting data. Standardize the response to what you do if you find forced labor. There's a lot of organizations that don't really know what they're going to do if they find it. What we need is to have that tough discussion We know it's a hard, difficult discussion to have, but we need to have it. We need to have consistent data, consolidation and use, and we need to have collaboration among the various players. So this was suggested a couple of years ago. But the last thing that was suggested was we need these component pieces to be put in the form of a unified plan. And that's what we're talking about here today. After a couple of years, we've developed a plan that answers the question of how to get the private sector to a point where slavery within supply chains is eliminated within a 30-year period of time. It is not the plan, it is a plan. And it is probably a plan that people will look at and say, well, you forgot this, you should add that. It doesn't matter. Those things can be revised and changed over time. And so what we're going to do is to go through this plan. But before we do this, I'm going to have Adam from Ashbury Communications talk about the relevance of this type of plan to ESG and COVID. And then Phil Marshall from RCG will actually go through the reasons why we came to the conclusions of the various components of this plan. And then what I will do is just have an ending where we will summarize this, and then we can get into a question and answer session. So with that, I am going to now turn it over to Adam. Adam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Adam Harper from Ashbury. It's a real pleasure to be here. According to the finite pool of worry hypothesis, humans have only limited emotional resources for worry, so that when we become more worried about one thing, we become less worried about others. But something very unusual is happening at the moment. The COVID-19 pandemic appears to have actually increased the global focus on climate change and social justice, just when you would expect people to be totally consumed with concern about the virus. Instead, we've seen extraordinary grassroots social movements gathering momentum and changing public perceptions, probably permanently. I'm talking, of course, about Black Lives Matter, about Extinction Rebellion, about the incredible energy that we've seen around Greta Thunberg and young people protesting on climate and other issues. Right now, as you well know, women are protesting against gender violence in the UK and Australia. There's this really tangible sense in the air almost that we cannot go on in the way we have, that the world needs to change, and that the pandemic should be the catalyst for that. We are seeing change from policymakers as well. The US has recommitted to the Paris Agreement since the election of President Biden. The president plans to spend $2 trillion on green energy and infrastructure over the next few years, and has just passed a historic and very popular $1.9 trillion stimulus program. China, in our part of the world, is the world's biggest emitter, and they pledged last year to reach net zero emissions by 2060, something that would have been hard to imagine not too long ago. In Asia, Japan and Korea have also committed to net zero by 2050. And companies are changing, as Matt pointed out. More and more are setting their own net zero targets when it comes to emissions, and they're setting goals for minorities and women to be represented in their management teams and boards. So social norms and priorities are being reshaped at pace. And as our cultures and values evolve, so too does the way that we invest. Perhaps for the first time in the history of modern capitalism, which some believe dates back to the 16th century, financial profit is not the only factor that investors are taking into account when they put money to work. So today I want to share a few thoughts in the next few minutes about how these profound changes are feeding through into investment decision making, why the time is right for forced labor to really take its place among investors' social and environmental priorities, and how a clearly defined target for ending forced labor in the private sector, as well as a measurable pathway for achieving it, could accelerate change in how financial investors approach the issue. Could we go on to the next slide, please? Thank you. As everybody on this call knows, the world's aspirations for humanity and the planet are enshrined in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And broadly speaking, investors who want their capital to support those 17 goals have a recognized framework for achieving that, which is alignment with environmental, social, and governance principles, or what is called ESG, and a term that is becoming, ubiquitous really these days. The key things that you need to know about ESG, if you're not already an expert, are that it's huge and it's growing fast. I have a few stats here for the more wonkish among you. Globally, ESG assets under management, so that's financial investments in stocks, bonds, etc., are on track to exceed $53 trillion by 2025, according to Bloomberg. That would be more than a third of the projected $140 trillion of total assets under management at that time. And if you look already, the signatories to the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment have more than $100 trillion of assets under management. The wall of money keeps coming to ESG. There were $347 billion of inflows into ESG funds last year, and over 700 new funds launched. Moody's, which is a credit rating agency, expects sustainable bond issuance to reach $650 billion this year. That's up by nearly a third on last year. And Bloomberg thinks that the $2.2 trillion of ESG-driven bonds outstanding today could reach $11 trillion in the next 4 years. So we already know that environmental and social issues are an increasingly important factor for consumers and for employees. But what is becoming clear from these really mind-boggling numbers is just how fast they are becoming one of the dominant trends of our time for investors. Now, in the past, to go back to a point that Matt made, many investors would have been concerned that they would have to give up on financial returns if they invested responsibly. But it's becoming increasingly clear that the opposite is true. During 2020, 81% of a globally representative selection of sustainable indexes outperformed their broader market benchmarks. In other words, the ESG investments outperformed investing as a whole. Today, and this would have been again unthinkable perhaps 5 years ago, the CEO of the world's biggest asset manager, BlackRock, is imploring companies to embrace ESG and act with purpose. And I quote, "The more your company can show its purpose in delivering value to its customers, its employees, and its communities, the better able you will be to compete and deliver long-term durable profits for shareholders," wrote Larry Fink earlier this year. But the challenge for many investors, as Mr. Fink highlights, is standards, and that's what I want to focus on next. Can I have the next slide, please? Without commonly accepted standards for ESG factors that are based on robust disclosure, it's very hard for investors to make informed judgments about the relative ESG performance of different companies and to allocate their capital accordingly. We can take climate, for example. The world has a clearly defined and commonly accepted target for climate, which is the 2-degree change enshrined in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Achieving that is understood to involve a transition to net zero emissions by the middle of this century. But how to get there? Each country has its own national plan, and there are a number of disclosure and reporting frameworks. And I'm going to give you a little bit of alphabet soup here without reading them all out in full. There's the TCFD, there's SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, there's the UN PRI that I mentioned, there's also the Principles for Responsible Banking, there's the Carbon Disclosure Project, there's the Global Reporting Initiative, and so on. TCFD and SASB are emerging as the leading frameworks, but global investors like BlackRock are calling for a single global standard to give purpose and direction to the industry's efforts, very much like what Matt was talking about when it comes to forced labor. And as many of you will know, there are just as many targets, best practice guidelines, codes of conduct when it comes to forced labor, as well as a growing body of legislation around the world. First of all, we've got the UN SDG 8.7, which is the one that talks about ending forced labor and modern slavery. There's legislation in California, the UK, Australia, more legislation being developed in other countries. There are UN guiding principles on business and human rights. There's the UN Global Compact, guidelines from the OECD. There's the ILO standards on forced labor, and there's the Liechtenstein Initiative as well, to name but a few. There are a lot of frameworks, principles, standards out there, and they're all very important. And there is a clear shift going on from the traditional voluntary guidelines, or what you might call soft law, towards legally binding regulation. But corporate disclosure when it comes to forced labor and supply chains is still limited. Experts say it often lacks quantitative data and can be out of date, leaving investors exposed to the risk that they are inadvertently financing companies that are not preventing slavery in their supply chains. And that lack of metrics constrains how accurately investors can use capital to reward companies that are outperforming when it comes to eliminating forced labor, and punish those that are underperforming. Next slide, please. That isn't to say that investors don't care about forced labor as an ESG factor. Quite the opposite, in fact. Investor coalitions are being formed, such as Votes Against Slavery, Investor Alliance for Human Rights, Finance Against Slavery and Trafficking, and Investors Against Slavery and Trafficking. And those alliances are incredibly valuable in terms of investors engaging with companies and exercising their stewardship responsibility. The lack of a framework that is aligned with a target and which can allow a company to demonstrate its progress on forced labor means that ESG investors often have to rely on what we call an exclusionary approach, eliminating companies that are reported to have had human rights violations from their portfolios. Shareholder services firms like ISS provide tools that allow investors to monitor for this kind of news and screen out companies that get it wrong. 𝗕𝗂𝘂𝗓 in Malaysia is a recent example that I'm sure many of you know about. In a nutshell, 𝗕𝗂𝘂𝘂𝗓 had reports of human rights violations. They also had one of the biggest COVID outbreaks in Malaysia in their dormitories. And going back to BlackRock, investors paid attention. Going back to BlackRock, the asset manager voted against the re-election of the 𝗕𝗂𝘂𝘂𝗓 board back in January. This kind of exclusionary approach can be very effective. It penalizes companies that are found not to be taking adequate measures to eliminate forced labor from their supply chains. And it's clear that investor responses to modern slavery are maturing. Increasingly, investors recognize the real risk of forced labor in long and complex supply chains. They're trying to encourage companies to identify and disclose these violations, but really enabling investors to differentiate between companies on this basis, on measures of how well they're addressing forced labor before they have a corporate scandal, will require greater disclosure and a commonly accepted pathway towards a shared target. Last slide, please. And that, of course, is one of the objectives of the Moon Goal that we're very proud to present today. We hope that our proposed pathway to achieving this goal can help to provide the information that investors are going to need to make better decisions about forced labor as an ESG factor. What we have here is an initial blueprint, but we believe that companies who choose to collaborate in developing this framework will be able to demonstrate to their investors that they are taking positive and hopefully measurable action towards a common goal. As well as helping to free millions from slavery, we hope that those companies will also secure an advantage in the capital markets because they will be rewarded by the growing ranks of ESG-focused investors around the world. To go back to Matt's point, they would not have to choose between what is right, what is sustainable, and what is profitable. Thanks very much, and over to you now, Phil.
Thanks, Adam. All right, so yeah, Matt, you can just, I think, go straight on to the next slide. Thanks. My name's Phil Marshall. I'm the Director of Private Sector Engagement for the Research and Communications Group, and I'm also a Mekong Club Director. And I'm going to talk today about breaking down the business case, but specifically about how we can become more effective in responding to modern slavery. So I think if we're to look at the aspects of a business case, you've got the benefits and of ethical and legally compliant practice. You've got offsetting that the level and consequence of risk. And I think that what we're finding is, I've used the term the coming storm, but as time goes on, there are more and more measures being taken against to hold companies accountable for what's happening in their supply chains. And as time goes on, there is a gradual move away from voluntary measures to a more focus on legal action. So I've talked. So there's also the issue of the short and long term, and I think Adam's articulated key issues around these first 3 points quite well in terms of looking at both some of the benefits and some of the risks of responding to modern slavery, but also the fact that I think the equation's changing over the short and long term. So what I wanted to focus on myself was the costs of being compliant, the costs of seeking out and addressing labour exploitations in supply chains. So when I did a draft of my presentation, I had a whole bunch of slides that looked like this, and Matt, who many of you know, is a master communications creator, and Adam, who is the director of a communications company, very politely told me that this was a very old way of going about things and that I was going to bore everybody. I still might do that, but I'm looking to take a slightly different approach, and I wanted to take a storytelling approach, Matt. So if you can flick over to the next slide, and just talk about some of the experiences that we've had over the last few years, and then relate that back to specific areas where we might improve. So I'm looking at in what I'm talking about specifically areas things that we can do better. So that's not to understate all of the positive things that we're doing. So if I sound a bit frustrated at times, it's because I think there's a lot of areas that we could be allocating resources to the things that we're doing more effectively rather than the things that we know aren't particularly working. So I want to talk about 5 things. The first thing is called Matt Friedman and the 𝗿𝗏 puzzle. The trafficker's finest hour, the non-matching buses, the naive volunteer, and the mobile fire extinguisher. So if we can start with Matt Friedman and the 𝗿𝗏 puzzle. Okay, so about 10 years ago, when Matt was at the UN, he funded some research on the 𝗿𝗏 border. And what they did, this research team, was they randomly interviewed deportees from Cambodia to Thailand. And from listening to their stories, they estimated that possibly as many as 23% of these deportees had been victims of human trafficking. 33% when it came to those working on fishing boats. So if you had, in theory at least, stood on that border at one single border point for a year, 100,000 people being deported, you could have identified 23,000 victims. There were only 45,000 victims officially identified globally that year. So obviously for me, this was an extremely interesting finding. And when I went to 𝗿𝗏 a year or so later, I expected that this would be on the radar. I was helping to design a counter-trafficking program. So I went to talk to people. I went to talk to people in the government. What do we need? And I was expecting to say, well, we found that we can identify a lot of people just by setting up at the border. No, I think we need to raise awareness of what? Of the risk of trafficking. All right. So I went to talk to some of the NGOs. What do you think we need to do? Oh, I think we need to raise awareness of the risks of human trafficking. So this was a bit surprising to me because there was obviously a lot of trafficking out of 𝗿𝗏 as a border town, as a town on the border with Thailand. And the town was only 40,000 people at the time, which was about the size of the town that I grew up in. So we started asking around. We would ask the taxi drivers, waiters, anybody, people who were working in shops, anybody that we talked to, whether they knew about migrating to Thailand. The 2 things we found out was everybody that knew there were risks involved. Well, the 3 things we found out. Everybody knew that there were risks involved. None of these people had got it from any of the, none of the people had got this from any of the awareness raising campaigns that had already been run. And that a lot of it often came down to people's own risk, own willingness to take risks. People had a general idea of what the risks were, but they just weren't, it depended on whether they thought they were good odds. So I think then I returned back home, and 2 months later, I learned that there was going to be a major music concert in 𝗿𝗏 to raise awareness of trafficking. Okay, so I think there were several points that I'd like to draw from that. Matt, if you can just click on the next thing. There's been millions and millions of dollars wasted worldwide in terms of awareness campaigns. And I won't go into this because anybody that's heard me talk for more than 2 minutes about trafficking knows my views on this. But at the same time, awareness raising is not just failing to raise to change behaviour. It's failing to give people the right education and information. So that 𝗖𝗨 did a survey and found out that only 1 in 7 migrants from Cambodia and Thailand actually knew what they needed to do in terms of protecting themselves and asserting their rights in terms of their jobs. So even though all this money has been spent, people still didn't have the information that they needed. On the other hand, certainly migrants through the official channels have to go through a pre-departure training, which would be a fantastic opportunity to educate people on their rights and on ways to come forward in ways that they could avenues of remedy and redress, which we'll talk about a bit later. That's not being used, underused resource. But at the same time, all this money, and it continues to be spent on people that might possibly one day become a victim of forced labour, modern slavery, while we don't help those people that are victims already, even when we know where they are. So for me, that's a couple of key inefficiencies in terms of the response. All right, next slide, please. The trafficker's finest hour. So I was talking to an NGO, again, this is a long time ago now, but the situation hasn't changed. They went to an immigration detention centre and they identified 98 people that were victims by their definition of trafficking. When they explained to them that if they came forward as victims of trafficking and were officially identified, they would be placed in a government shelter for a period likely to be about 6 months. And at the end of that time, they would have to return back to their own country regardless. 94 of those 98 chose not to come forward. So why is that why have I called this the trafficker's finest hour? Because they've managed to get we've managed to, by the very nature of the programs that are supposed to help victims, dissuade 94 of 98 from coming forward and reporting their cases. If you were a trafficker, you could hardly think of a better type of intervention than that, or a better type of dissuasive action than that. So, and this plays into another point, which is the idea that if somebody has a complaint, if somebody has a violation of their rights, they will come forward and report it. And I've heard this at international meetings, that if people have complaints, they always come out and tell people that, up until a lot of people. Well, when it comes to victims of trafficking and forced labour, that just isn't true. And there's a whole series of reasons for that. Matt? Yeah. So lack of knowledge about their rights, fear of retaliation, but also the fact that particularly in a lot of countries, trafficking victims and for forced labour victims are defined as victims of trafficking, they will be put in a shelter which they cannot leave. And they will then, at the end of their time, be deported to their own country. We don't call it deported, we call it voluntary return or just return or repatriation, but at the end of the day, they have no choice. It also means that we're spending money on services that people don't want, which again is another inefficiency. And all that together adds to lack of confidence in the system. And I've had a lot of people tell me over many years they do have more information about specific cases, but there's no point, they don't want to report it because their information and their experience is that bad things will happen, not good things, as a result of reporting violations. Okay, next slide, please. The non-matching buses. So a friend of mine was working for a company who were concerned, for a buyer, who were concerned that the company that they were buying from was illegally taking waste off-site. So in order to find out, they essentially staked out that factory by setting up a small fruit stand outside over a period of a week. And the point of them doing that was that they wanted to be able to observe what was going in and out of the factory, but they were also hoping to engage with some of the workers that came in and out. And one day, the friend of mine, he saw that the company that had dropped the workers off from, that was picking the workers up from the factory was different from the bus company that was drop them off in the morning. And in his experience, this was a strange and unusual thing. Why would a factory employ two different bus companies? So out of curiosity, and I think this is an illustrative story in terms of the fact that he actually wanted to know what was going on. That was his incentive. He followed the bus, and what he found was that the bus drove to another factory, and the migrants got out of the bus, went to the factory. A few minutes later, a whole lot of other workers came out of the second factory, got on the bus and drove back to the first factory. Now, the reason they were doing that is so that when it came to anybody looking at their sheets, they would see that nobody had worked any overtime, because they had one group of workers working an 8-hour shift and another group of workers, a different group of workers working a second 8-hour shift. Migrants were keen to get the income, so they were taking part in this with probably under a degree of pressure. It sounds such an unlikely story, except that the reason that I've been talking to my friend in the first place was that I'd been talking to 𝗖𝗎, the 𝗖𝗎 Institute, and they'd had reports from migrants of this very thing happening. But what I really want to draw out from this is you've got workers working back-to-back 8-hour shifts, 6 days a week. Just how efficient and non-error prone are those workers likely to be towards the end of the week? It's an incredibly inefficient management practice. I mean, we know that road accidents go up 20% the day after we put our clocks forward for daylight saving, because 1 hour of sleep matters that much to people. So it's a sign we've developed a culture around low wages, worker exploitation, which has led to extremely inefficient workplaces. Then at the other end of the scale, we can also relate this inefficiency to the recruitment process. So we have people, because migrant workers, the costs of the recruitment are always passed on to migrant workers. There's no great incentive for recruiters to be efficient. There's no great incentive for recruiters to find the right workers for the right jobs. And there's actually an active incentive for having recruiters for having high worker turnover or churn, because then they get more money. So actually the recruiters are incentivized to have workers that will not stay at the factory, which is the very opposite of what you would want in terms of an efficient work situation. So Matt, can you click the next point? So we have inefficiencies in the recruitment process. We have inefficiencies and mismatches in jobs, which lead to high turnover, and these things contribute to and are contributed to by inefficient workplaces. So again, I think the other point I wanted to illustrate about this with regard to my friend who was involved in the auditing was he found this violation because he really wanted to, because the incentive was doing that to the extent that they were prepared to stay outside the factory for several days. Next slide, please. I don't really have anything to say about this slide. I just put it up so that you could see what I used to look like when I had hair. No, in fact, this is about, I was a UN volunteer about 25 years ago, and I was a UN volunteer working in the HIV/AIDS office in 𝗨𝗶𝘂𝗂𝗏, and I was there, young, quite confident young guy. I'd been there, it was I think the Friday of my second week, and I was sitting there and I had a couple of what I thought were great suggestions for the boss, and he just said, and this is the way that he had my boss, Bill, sometimes it's good to know what's in the cake before you take a bite, which was a very polite way of telling me that to shut up because I didn't really know what I was talking about. And I wanted to, over time, of course, I was there over a period of time. I started to learn how things work. I started to learn that some of my ideas were not actually, things weren't as clear cut as I thought. But I wanted to talk about that in terms of how it relates to what I call lessons never learned. So, a good example of people not fully understanding the circumstances is with regard to various ethical codes which cap the working week in Thailand at 48 hours. Now, the legal working week in Thailand is 66 hours. I think it might be 60, but it's well more than 48. And there are communities in which people put up billboards, employees put up billboards guaranteeing workers overtime. So you have a situation where the workers keen to maximise their income, and when you talk to most workers, this comes up regularly, want as much overtime as possible. You've got you've got a code which was developed far away, which is no, you're only allowed to work 48 hours a week. So you have a code which doesn't address the wishes of the recruiters, and it leads to employers actually losing some of their workers to people who are offering more overtime. So what's happening, and part of this is that happens is that this is part of a wider picture in which we are making changes, we are spending resources on things that are known not to work. So Matt, can you just click on the next? So we have lessons, and you see a lot of papers around lessons learned, but the lessons are never learned because as I say, these examples that I'm talking about, many of them date back several years. We don't have a system within this sector to learn from our mistakes and to learn from what works. And as a result, often we end up, or sometimes we end up making things worse. We also spend a lot of money on airfares and hotels and interpreters with people like myself flying into different countries. And there's another area that's another area where we can look at becoming more efficient. And I'll come back to this in the last slide. Next slide, please. All right, the mobile phone extinguisher. The mobile fire extinguisher, sorry. So this again, I mentioned 𝗖𝗎 once before, and I should mention that quite a bit of this experience that I've been talking about comes from either talking to 𝗖𝗎 staff or doing some work with them. So I just wanted to flag the very good work that they're doing on the ground in terms of working directly with migrants to help them resolve different violations. But one of the stories was in the middle of a meeting, the manager had to excuse himself for a couple of minutes to go and move the fire extinguisher to a different place on the wall, because the auditor that was just about to come in came from a company that had a different standard to the one that had just been in before. And you could hardly get a better illustration of the inefficiencies of having different standards, different companies and different buyers having different standards. And this is particularly relevant in terms of the current model of looking at these issues, where it tends to be people looking down. The idea is that companies will work with the companies at the suppliers at the higher level of their supply chains, and that will then sort of get that to filter down to the lower levels. And that they've been doing some work for the Organization of Security and Economic Cooperation in Europe, and they've developed some model procurement guidelines, and it basically says, it codifies that and says you need to talk to your suppliers and get them to talk to your suppliers. So what this means, we have a vertical model in which we start at the top. Things very rarely get down to the lower supply chain tier levels where most of the problems occur, which is extremely inefficient. So what we then have is a situation where we have, Matt, can you, next please. So we have multiple and different standards. So we're reinventing the wheel, but we're often reinventing the wheel in slightly different ways. We end up having multiple audits, although this is an area where companies are now starting to share, so that's becoming an area of less inefficiency. We have multiple grievance mechanisms, and with a situation where it creates a perverse incentive where the companies who have the best grievance mechanisms are likely to have the most problems identified. We have a duplicate of research. Every 3 months, I will see terms of reference for a piece of research done on something that's been researched to death. And then we have another area of inefficiency is apps. So I think the OSCE that I just mentioned, they did a publication and identified, I think it's over 300 apps now, but many of them do very similar things. So again, a huge waste of resources. So, Matt, next slide, please. So as you see, I've been talking about a whole series of inefficiencies within the response to date and things that we can do better. And these lead into the discussions we've had about what should be in the 𝗠𝗏𝗀 plan. So if I can just briefly sum up, we have a huge loss of resources through duplication and ineffectiveness, particularly doing things that have already been demonstrated not to work, and often not to work over a very long period of time to date. And then we have metrics not aligned with what makes a difference. So I haven't talked so much about that, but we have a lot of ways of measuring company performance which give credit for things that aren't actually moving the dial in terms of effectiveness issue, and Adam touched on that as well. So in response to these two issues, these are the first 2 points of the 𝗠𝗏𝗀 plan: to develop a clear and common understanding of modern slavery. And we're looking to do that partly through a one-stop shop web portal, which Matt might like to talk a little bit more about, but which will be a place that people can go to get information from across the anti-slavery movement, not from just individual organisations. The good guys have information to respond effectively. It's not actually called that in the target, but the idea is that we develop some training, some materials, some examples of genuine effective promising practice, genuine lessons learned, independent of of materials that people want to promote individual programs. The third, the next thing that we've identified, and this is the one that for me is particularly dear to my heart, is that victims are not being identified and helped. And we talked about that. Matt gave some figures earlier on. In response to that, the idea, there's a focus on having multi-stakeholder monitoring, feedback, and remedy systems. So the idea is that rather than individual companies having their own monitoring grievance mechanisms, we develop collaborative approaches to this, where which starting from pre-departure processes in which migrants can be informed of their rights. Obviously that only works for migrant workers, but the idea is the first component is for worker education. And then through that process, you create common ways for people to report grievances, and then common ways to address both the case itself, the individual grievance, and remedy that grievance, but also looking back at the cause. How did this grievance come about? And if you have a multi-stakeholder mechanism that everybody can access regardless of company, that also means that people from supply chains outside of those that are supporting the mechanism can come forward with complaints, which can help to level the playing field. Related to that, improved reframed social audits are extremely well documented that social audits are not proving to be very effective in terms of responding, identifying grievances and problems and labour problems in the workplace. The Mekong Club has collected a lot of data, a lot of audit data already. Part of the process in doing that is identifying that different companies are asking different audited questions. It's not always being done in the most efficient way. It's not being done with worker feedback, appropriate worker feedback or worker voice. So before we throw out the whole concept of social audits, I think there are lots of opportunities that we may look at how they may be improved and or reframed to contribute to the goal of identifying grievances. Finally, recruitment systems are inefficient and exploitative. So I think, as most people know, the large fees that people are paying for recruitment are contributing to debt, which is binding them to the workplace that they might otherwise be able to leave. There's a lot of talk about employer pays and who should pay, and I think that's great, but I think probably not enough talk about the cost itself. So if you look at migration from Cambodia to Thailand, for example, the migrants normally pay about $800, whereas the true cost of that migration process should probably be around $250. So if we focus on what the types of migration fees should be, as well as who should be paying for them, that might make the who pays discussion a bit easier. So I think it's not simply as easy as saying the migrant shouldn't pay for the costs and the employers can. It requires an understanding of recruitment systems, an understanding of the role of sub-brokers and whether they're an integral part of the system or the most exploitative agent, and what might be done about that. So that leads to our fifth aspect of the main goal, which is develop ethical and sustainable recruitment solutions. And by sustainable, they have to obviously be, you know, they have to suit the needs also of recruiting agencies. Otherwise, we've already learned that the recruiting agencies are going to look to work around any new regulations that are put in place. Obviously, there will still be unethical recruiters, but there's a potential to crowd them out if we come up with solutions that work for those who are interested in playing within the rules. So that's all I have to say for now, but I'm going to pass back to Matt to talk a little bit more about the Moon Goal plan itself.
Well, thank you so much for that, Phil. You know, it's great to hear you using stories. I always find it is a very effective way of kind of conveying lessons learned and experience, and helps people to understand the context. You know, one of the things that I want to preface before I go through my last 4 slides, or 4 or 5 slides, is that the private sector has been doing things related to this topic actually well before California transparency and any of the other legislation. There have been forced labor laws in place, there have been audits in place, there have been all kinds of elements in place for quite some time. And you know, a lot of times we hear about how the NGOs did this or that. I remember visiting some factories in China in 1991, and then I've seen the similar factories in the same location 25 years later, and amazing improvements because the private sector was there, going in, auditing, making the corrections and so forth. And I often feel that the private sector doesn't get credit for the amazing things that they were able to do. So this plan that we keep talking about, as we said, we were trying to come up with something that offered a roadmap forward for how we could collectively link our activities. We know that individual factories and individual companies and individual brands are doing their own thing, but the idea is how do we go up to say 30,000 feet and link some of those things together to see if we can get more of a synergistic effect. The impact of kind of the convergence of all of these things together to identify some of the redundancies and reduce them, and to take the practical experience that was indicated in Phil's statements and apply it to the private sector side of things. So we acknowledge that a lot of amazing work is already being done. We acknowledge this approach is hugely ambitious, and I urge you to read the paper. We kept it to less than 10 pages because none of us want to read anything more than 10 pages, including myself. And so there were things that we wanted to add, but we would take other things out to ensure that we had priority in there. There was no one ideal solution to anything, but a common direction is needed. And so we thought this plan would offer at least a direction forward. Whether you agree with the components or whether you would have done something else, that is debatable, but the idea is to start with something and then have people critique and modify until we get to a point where we get momentum as a community of people working together, not a couple of authors having pulled this together thinking that this is the way it's going to end up being. Great things can be accomplished when people unite behind a united plan. And I've seen this through my efforts focusing on HIV/AIDS, sex trafficking, communicable diseases, disaster mitigation. At the end of the day, what we're talking about is connecting the dots. Now, in the paper, we talk about some kind of guiding principles that we held ourselves to as we were writing the first draft and second draft and third draft. One of them was unity of purpose is essential. And I feel like, once again, if we could get 1 + 1 in terms of collaboration correct, it will equal 11, not 2, if we can really find a way of taking the best of what everybody has and moving forward, which is exactly what the second statement was. Take the best of what is already available and apply it to what we have. So, you know, there are lessons learned over the years that I've seen where there are certain interventions that I would kind of fund in a heartbeat because I know they add value. I've seen it over time. I've been out in the field, I've experienced it, and other things that I've seen being done over and over and over again that don't really add that much value. And there's a point at which we just have to ask ourselves, why are we doing these things? So we wanted to support genuine collaboration as part of the process, ensure that all initiatives are empirically based, Now, that's not always easy because there's a lot of data out there, but in terms of the analysis of the data to allow us to understand what the data tells us, we have to do a lot more of that, and that's built into the plan. Ensure that all initiatives have the right technical support. You know, the thing about getting it right when it comes to the sophistication of the technical work that we're working on for something like this, you need the right people focusing on this. We're not talking about newbies coming into a sector or people who are generalists. We really need to find a way of connecting the people who have a certain expertise with others who have similar expertise to see if we can get a collective action moving forward. We need to instill a sense of urgency. I keep coming back to the 25,200 people per day entering modern slavery. And actually, the number of people that are entering is about that. The number of people that get helped every year is about 100, or every day is about 137. That's where you get the distinction of it being less than 0.5%. And so we can do better. Certainly we can get up to at least 2% or eventually 5% or 10%, but we have to kind of understand that for that to happen, we have to make changes and we have to put this on the front burner as something that's relevant and important that needs a lot of attention. We need to promote practical solutions. Many of the stories that Phil was talking about are very based on practicality, common sense, simple experiences, simply asking people for feedback and applying it. And lastly, demonstrate a measurable, sustainable response. And so Phil very briefly talked about the 5 components. I won't go into them. I want you to read the paper. But for each of them, and you can see them listed here, there is a problem statement, a proposed solution, and most importantly, a set of targets. So what this basically means that if we could come together as more of a community and connect all kinds of dots up so that different organizations and consortiums and groups are working together, collectively we could reach targets across the board that ensure sustainability, ensures standardization, ensures that, you know, we're all working from the same template in a sense, so that you could just compare what's happening in Asia with Africa and someplace else. And that's an extremely important part of the process. The strategy talks about a portal or a common unified location that is not branded, it's not owned by anyone, where we did add a kind of a repository of where you go to get research and data from a company, the capacity building, legal service, et cetera, for which those organizations that want to be listed here would be listed. It would take you to their website so companies could have a one-stop shop. There's a business index kind of tool that allows a company to be able to put in their parameters of what they're doing and not doing to get a relative sense of what the business index average is to compare themselves. There would be updates from stakeholder groups, important news, a knowledge hub that would allow for all of the kind of newspaper articles related to modern slavery to be in one place. The idea is to have a one-stop place so that as the moon goal moves forward, we would also be able to kind of track and offer information to organizations involved. There are different tools that are being done out there that collect anonymized data and analyze it. We need more of that. If we could get that standardized across kind of all of the business sector working in manufacture, we would certainly have a much better picture of what's happening and not happening, what the trends are. We could use blockchain technology as a means of kind of going into factories and sub-factories and putting the information in a format that is immutable, but at the same time, by doing that, you get amazing metrics. You get numbers, you get numbers that allow you to basically understand what people are doing or not doing, et cetera, et cetera. And that data is an important part of us being able to be a lot more efficient at what we do. And lastly, environment, governance, and social ESG. We see this as an emerging area. We expect that this is going to be something that at the end of the day is going to make a big difference. And Adam was able to talk about that. The last thing I'll say is that we include 10-year targets. I'm not going to go through them, but what these targets basically do is just outline, if we were to come together with this type of plan, what are some of the things that we would want to achieve? These would be adjusted over time based on the reality of the groups that are working together and the momentum that's being made and so forth. So the next steps, the Mekong Club and RCG and Ashbury Communications are going to, in mid-April or early April, have another event to see if there are organizations that want to join us in this process of kind of consolidating what the plan does. It's perfectly, it's up to every organization to decide whether or not this is something that they want to be a part of. If you are, then join. If not, that's okay too. But much of what we're really trying to do is to not recreate anything. It's more about connecting the dots and making sure that as a part of this process, we get more out of our collective activities when we unite. We are doing this on CNN's My Freedom Day, and we're doing it on this day because we understand that they are reaching out to students all over the world, private companies all over the world, faith-based all over the world. This year they have a pledge. I encourage you to go on their website to watch CNN Today. There's a lot of really interesting broadcasts that will be on there. If you want more information, by all means, come to me and I'll give you some additional insights into what we're seeing happen on this day. And with that, we're done. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, by all means, put them into the question or chat boxes and we're happy to answer them. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thanks, Matt. Hi, it's Phoebe here from Mekong Club. So we have a number of questions that have come into the chat function already, sorry, the question function already. As Matt said, please, if you have any more, put them in here and I will make sure they get addressed. So Matt, maybe I'll just throw the questions out to the panel and kind of see what you guys think in terms of who might be best to answer. So the first question relates to the Moon Goal project in terms of what skill sets do you believe need to be at the table in order to achieve this?
I will start off with this. A smart mind, an interest in wanting to be a part of a collaborative process, a team player, and some type of skill. And the skills will vary. I mean, communication skills, supply chain management skills, any number of other related skills. I think what we've found is that people who are motivated to address this issue because for whatever reason, it's kind of in their DNA that they want to address it, that enthusiasm goes a long way. So there are other people who are highly technical, but they don't necessarily have a strong desire to get involved in that. I would rather have the enthusiastic person come because what we're really trying to do is to get a lot of different ideas and suggestions to basically piece together something that's going to add value. Adam, Phil, do you want to add to that?
I think you've said it all, Matt.
Great. So next up, we have a question around one particular element of the Moon Goal. So the question asks, how are you planning to support and or work with ethical recruitment solutions as part of this plan?
Bill, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think what we're looking to do with this is basically to try and have some discussions around what's proving effective, what's not proving effective. There's been a very, I think, in my view, the discourse has been a little bit dominated by employer pays, without looking at the wider ramifications of employer pays, the idea that who pays for the recruitment piece, it should be the employers. And I think there are a lot, there's a need for us to come to a shared understanding of the complexities of different recruitment pathways and how the different types of action that can be taken to try and make recruitment more ethical are likely to be responded to on the ground. And we've already seen any number of examples of workarounds in terms of the types of things that are meant to make recruitment cheaper, more ethical, and the way that recruiters have already moved to work around that. So it's more, I think that the first step is to more have a discussion about and to try and some consensus around the types of things that we need to do to build sustainable ethical recruitment models. But the other thing in terms of specific pilot action, I think there's a lot more scope for looking at joined up migration pathways where you have initiatives that work at both end of the spectrum, the place of origin, but also the place of destination. And I think there's also a lot of potential for public-private partnerships, because as I was talking about in one of the earlier slides, there's a lot of investment in awareness raising in education. A lot of that investment hasn't gone anywhere. A lot of it comes from public sector organisations, and there's a huge potential for us to reharness, repackage, reuse those resources in ways that help to equip the migrants with the information and the resources that they need to make their journey safer.
Thank you very much, Phil. So in terms of developing this goal as a collective, someone has asked what kinds of organisations, if any, have been engaged so far in terms of developing this Moon goal?
As part of the process, I did kind of a 14-month review of both documentation, reports, and interviewed a bunch of people. And this include private sector representatives of all types, legal people, risk assessment people, C-suite directors, as well as various NGOs that had an emphasis on basically working with the private sector on issues related to supply chains. And so we wrote several drafts, we shared it with a number of people. We do not pretend to say that this is the end all and final strategy. We just wanted to get something out there so that people could begin looking at it and saying, well, I think you got this right, or you should add that, or so we're totally open to suggestions. We just wanted to get the ball rolling, and that's the reason why we moved in the direction of putting this paper out.
Great, thank you, Matt. And then in terms of kind of engaging other organisations going forward and kind of considering the fact that there's so many different cultures around the world that we should be engaging with, how do we foresee we will be connecting through this variety of different cultures and kind of bringing these various actors into the group?
I have an answer, but I want to see if anyone else has an answer first.
Go ahead, Matt.
You know, I mean, we can't do everything for everybody. I think part of what needs to happen is when I was working for the United Nations, we had this technique where we would basically list everything we could possibly imagine related to interventions associated with addressing sex trafficking. And then maybe there's 60 on the list. And then we would say, okay, start crossing them out collectively as a group until we get down to the last 4, 5, 6 that we think are most relevant based on this process. Now, this is the reverse of asking somebody the question, what is the most important thing that you should be focusing on, which is really difficult because you don't have the universe in front of you to know that. If you cross out, you eventually get to what is considered to be the most important. So for each of the 5 areas, we would probably use a process that's similar to that to get it down to a certain number of things that we think is within the manageable interest of the size of the group that we eventually come up with. And then as the group gets bigger and if resources become available or whatever, then we can expand beyond that. But the idea is to at least get something going within the categories to be able to see if we could add value to what's already existing out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would just, sorry, Phoebe, I mean, I would just add to reiterate the point about having, you know, that effective programming, you know, it's a bit mundane to say, but that has to be linked to what's happening on the ground. And that varies from place to place, from context to context, and it can't be, you know, it's great to have global slogans around different things, but you know, it has to be informed by the realities, and these are very different from place to place, in terms of a whole range of not just cultural issues, but also how that interplays to the role of government, the commitments that governments have, the effectiveness of law enforcement, and all of these things which impact on the situation in different countries. The role of trade unions, civil society organisations again.
Thanks, Phil. I actually have a question for you, Phil. You touched on this during your presentation, but the question asker is interested, what do you think are the solutions or alternatives to the ineffective audits that you mentioned? Do you think the audit model can be improved as it is, or do you think it needs to be done away with altogether and replaced with something else?
I don't know is the short answer, but I think, and I don't think we actually necessarily know the answer to that question in general, because I think there are problems with the audit model. So I'm not sure whether it is that the model itself doesn't, that the concept isn't right, or the way we're applying it isn't right. But I would say a key thing, there needs to be some kind of standardization, because when I was looking at the different audit data that we had, a lot of the questions were different from auditor to auditor, and some of them were kind of really strange and not likely to yield insights into, they were way too broad. Does the company follow labour laws? So they weren't getting down to the nitty-gritty. So that was one thing. There were clear issues, and I know that the Mekong Club's developed an app to contribute to this, but a bit of advertising. But there are clear issues with the role of migrant voice beyond migrant feedback, of just answering questions that we think are important. And I think that's been one of the problems, that there's a tendency to ask migrant workers issues that we consider important, which may not be the same ones that they consider important, like access to childcare for accompanying children, for example, is an issue which I've never seen come up in these discussions, but which comes up a lot when you're talking to the migrant workers themselves. But I think the third one, and I suspect that in some ways this is the most important, is the incentives. So what are the incentives for auditors to identify problems? The example I gave with the buses, my friend, his job was to make sure there were, if there were problems, they were identified. It wasn't to do what Nick Groner from the Freedom Fund once called soft tick auditing, where you go around and say, well, things look to be all right. So you've got the incentive. What incentives are there for auditors to really dig deep, and what disincentives are there for auditors to not find things? So we've seen, most of these major workplace disasters, the well-documented ones with Rana Plaza, etc., have been audited by a number of companies. So you've got, I think there's all those three things, I would say, the quality of the questions being asked, the access to workers, and the incentives that there are on auditors to really push and find problems.
I need to add to this just because I can't help myself. I did work with public health in Nepal for many years, and what would happen is there would be kind of an audit that would be done by one of the health technical people at hospitals and health posts, and it had something like 411 fields. And the thing would take an entire day and a half to fill it out, and this would be done sometimes every month or every other month, and it was a tremendous drain. And so somebody had this idea, let's come up with what we think the potential problems would be, and let's just have them be a proxy. Instead of the 411 things, let's just ask 30 things. And so they went in and they just focused on those things, and for whatever reason, they were finding more issues and problems because they weren't overwhelmed with the sheer volume of data. What happens with audits is you keep adding and adding and adding to them, but they tend not to be cut down. It's kind of like government bureaucracy. You keep adding, but it's really hard to figure out a way of cutting it down. I think if there are ways of kind of reducing the things that are just so routine in an audit that companies are going to get it right and there's no issues or problems, and just focusing on the health and safety and labor issues that could be most problematic, and go deep into that and make sure you get the worker voice and everything else, you'd have a much better audit system. But it's hard to change something that's been in place for a lot of companies for a long time.
Thank you, Matt. I have So in terms of logistics, for those of you asking whether a recording or the link to the paper or the slides will be circulated after this session, yes, they will. You guys are all on a distribution list, so we'll make sure that you have all of the materials that you need to follow up on this session after the session has ended. I have one more kind of big question for the panel, and that is related to the role of government. So what do you see as the role of government in achieving and supporting the private sector to achieve this goal? And how do you think governments can best be engaged? It's a big question. I'll just put it to the panel, whoever wants to take it.
I can jump in here if you like,
Yeah.
with a view from the the sort of ESG and investment side. In other aspects of ESG, I mean, again, if we take climate as an example, governments are beginning to regulate and mandate, but industry and the private sector have already made a lot of progress in terms of establishing their own frameworks. And the view from big investors, again, going back to BlackRock, who I used as an example, is that the private sector should work out what it wants its standards to be and get behind a single set of standards before it's basically forced to do so by regulation and by government. So I think if we see forced labor in the context of ESG, it is incumbent on the private sector to demonstrate to governments that it's taking action, that it has a clear goal, that it has a measurable pathway towards getting there. That would be the corollary of what we're seeing in other aspects of ESG.
Great, thank you. I actually have one more question that's just snuck in, but it's a good one. So the question is, what do you think organizations might need to sacrifice or even kind of rethink in order to really be a part of this unified plan?
I don't think they have to necessarily give up anything, but I do feel like an evolution of change is needed at this particular time. There's usually not enough resources within private companies to do all the things that the risk assessment people want to do. I hope that changes over time as ESG and corporate social responsibility priorities are increased. But I have found in my 30 years of working with all different types of organizations, this includes government, private sector, NGO, United Nations, is this idea that change is bad, or it can't be done, or it needs to go through a long, tedious process. I think that kind of finding a way of freeing up those people who think that they really know what the solution is to be able to experiment and to test and to refine and improve to eventually come up with something that works within their organization, and as part of this moon goal approach, to be able to share those ideas with others and get feedback and get a lot of other organizations doing it, I think would add value to where we are now. It's just institutions in general tend to be very slow in terms of change.
Great, that actually concludes the questions. Matt, so shall I pass back to you for any concluding remarks?
Yeah, I would just want to thank everybody very much. We don't pretend to have all the answers. We don't. We recognize that among our collective community, when we come together, a lot of what we need to know is there. We don't pretend to be able to say what exactly needs to be done between now and 6 months or a year. We don't want to be the ones to do this. We want to do this through a collective action. So we are encouraging people who really want to be a part of this process to join us. But our sincere request is that if you say you want to be a part of it, then commit yourself to doing it and commit yourself to sticking it out, because sometimes there's that desire to do something that hits you right at the moment, and then you get too busy and too many other things come into your life. So we're looking for like-minded organizations that have as a basic premise, we collectively can do better if we unite our experiences and try to develop kind of a layer above our individual institutions to be able to add value to addressing this topic. And that's the kind of spirit and the essence of this particular goal. We are going to come up with a SurveyMonkey questionnaire to get feedback from you on the presentation itself, the tool, or rather the strategy itself, and ask for recommendations of how we can move forward. You'll be sent an invitation to be a part of this. There won't be more than 8 or 10 questions. I just ask that you participate. It helps us to refine and improve things for future activities. And with that, I want to thank Phil, I want to thank Adam, I want to thank Kat, who helped to set this up, and Phoebe, and everyone else who was involved, and really appreciate all of your support. Thank you very much.